Hello, everybody, again. Welcome to the second installment of the Canadian Optimist series. We kicked this off last month with Ontario Labour Minister Monty McNaughton and got a lot of great feedback, and really excited to continue this each month, exploring reasons why we feel optimistic about our country during a time where I think it's very easy to feel discouraged. And it's great to hear the stories of leaders and innovators who are looking for inspiration at a time where I think we need it. So this has been a fantastic thing to get started, and really looking forward to our second installment here today with a phenomenal guest. Before we introduce him, and before I introduce my co-hosts for the Canadian Optimist discussion series, I do want to go over a couple things that the Canada Strong and Free Network has been working on since we last spoke with you. The first one being that we have successfully completed our application process for our new mentorship program. This is probably the most exciting thing I think happening in our organization right now, in terms of reaching out to conservatives who are under the age of 30 and getting them involved in our organization, connecting them with mentors in the conservative movement, and making sure that they see all the opportunities and support available to them as young conservatives in this country. So we have received many applications. We've gone through them. We are in the process of making final selections right now, and we'll be announcing that first cohort, the inaugural Conservative Values Tomorrow participants, at some point next week. So we're really excited about that and look forward to sharing all their stories and their bios and their profiles with you. There are some truly phenomenal young conservatives in this country, and I can't wait for you to get to know them. So that's one of the things that's been keeping us busy. And then the second thing we've been working on is our next networking conference, which is happening in Red Deer, Alberta on September 24th. We've been able to announce a couple of the things we have scheduled for that day. The first being the UCP Leadership Showcase, where the people who are vying to be the next leader of the Alberta United Conservative Party will be joining us to share their vision for the future of Alberta and the future of the country. Our conference will be just 2 weeks after the next federal leadership results, so it'll be a good time to hear how people in Alberta and some of our national leaders are thinking about the future of conservatism in the country. We will also be joined by the #1 best-selling author in Canada right now, Andrew Lawton. He's the author of the Freedom Convoy, and he'll be joining us to talk about his book, as well as to host a live episode of his show, The Andrew Lawton Show, on stage. And that's going to be really exciting. I'm looking forward to it. And something we haven't announced yet, but this is breaking news. Sean Speer, who is one of the founders of The Hub, many of you, I'm sure, read that publication. He'll be also joining us on September 24th, and we'll be doing an interview with outgoing Premier Jason Kenney. It will be one of Jason Kenney's last public engagements as Premier of Alberta, and it'll be very interesting to hear what he sees as his legacy and the state of Alberta, the state of Canada, as he leaves his role as Premier of one of our most impactful provinces economically. So really interesting lineup is coming together for September 24th. If you'd like to register at our early bird rate, it is still available, but it will not be available for much longer before we go to the regular ticket price. So you can visit our website, canadastrongandfree.network. I'm sure that Zoe can also put the link in the chat for where you can register for the conference, but we do hope to welcome you there. And if you do attend the Alberta conference, you will get a discount for our next conference in Ottawa, which will be next spring in 2023. So all of those announcements and details aside, I'm very happy to welcome my co-hosts, Chris Spoke and Matt Spoke, the Canadian Optimists.
Thank you, Jamil. So as Jamil mentioned, I'm Chris Spoke. I operate a digital product studio here in Toronto called August, and this is now the second edition of our Canadian Optimist speaker series. So to tell you a little bit about the series, our intention with the series is to identify and interview Canadian optimists inside or outside of government. We, of course, had Ontario Labour Minister Monty McNaughton in July, specifically to promote their optimism and inspire others to adopt it for themselves. So we have a very specific way in which we think about optimism. So we define optimists as people who think that the future can be better than the present, but who also know that they need to work hard to make it so. So this is in contrast to a brand of extreme optimism that is counterintuitively similar to extreme pessimism in one important way. So both extreme optimists and extreme pessimists think that there's nothing to be done, right? So the extreme optimists see a bright future unfolding as a foregone conclusion. The extreme pessimists see the same but a dark and diminished future, but either way as a foregone conclusion. So we take the view that we need to be a little bit more definite in our optimism. We need to both be optimistic about the future, but also recognize that it does not unfold according to its own plans, but it needs to be built and crafted by people who want to see it be great. So to make that a little bit more concrete, Matt is going to introduce our guest, Anthony Lacavera, shortly, but I wanted to read a short excerpt from his book, How We Can Win, that kind of, I think, drives this point home. So this is from the book. To ensure Canada's future prosperity, we need to hang on to our most talented and innovative people, the ones who will add the most value to our economy, whether they're software developers or teachers or farmers. And we also need to attract immigrants of a similar caliber, as many as we can get. That won't happen until we change the way we do business in Canada. I say until, not unless, because I'm an optimist, but I also don't think there's another option. If we don't make some fundamental changes to the way we think about and approach competition, we can stop worrying about the future. We won't have one. So you'll see kind of like in that excerpt, there's both some optimism, but also some pessimism. And it's really this idea that we can be optimistic, but we need to get to work. Things don't just get better on their own. So with that said, with that out of the way, Matt is going to introduce Anthony, who we're very happy to have join us. He is a true Canadian optimist. And then we'll jump into some questions.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I met Anthony a couple of years ago when I was just getting started as a tech entrepreneur. And I think this discussion's interesting for a couple of reasons. One, we're going to talk specifically about what Anthony is doing in the Canadian telecom industry and what he has tried to do in the past. Anthony is best known for having been the founder of Wind Mobile over a decade ago, that endeavored to become the fourth carrier in Canada to compete with Rogers, Bell, and Telus. And he's back at it. He's back in the ring trying to reestablish that company under a new brand, Freedom Mobile, as a significant carrier to go head to head and compete to drive innovation and better outcomes for Canadians. But also, as Chris mentioned, Tony wrote a really influential book. I mean, I've been a tech entrepreneur for about 7 years, and his book still stands out in my mind as the most influential book that sort of helped frame the way I think about competitiveness and innovation in tech in Canada. Chris kind of beat me to the punch in terms of pulling an excerpt from the book, but I think it's, Canadians don't often realize the problem that we're dealing with when it comes to innovation and productivity. And I thought there was one really, really interesting anecdote that I wanted to share that comes right out of the book. We talked a lot about our history of innovation in this country. We often overlook some of the unfortunate failures in the history of Canadian innovators. And I think this book does a really good job at sort of highlighting some of those. So, quickly, and then we'll get into questions to get Anthony telling us a little bit about what he's been up to recently. But here's a true story out of Anthony's book. There's a worldwide race to get a revolutionary technology to market, and 2 Canadians are in the lead. They've come up with something that lasts longer and works better than anything that has gone before. There's a flurry of excitement, and early investors back the pair's startup. They secure patents, but when they begin trying to scale their company to develop their product and get it to market, their investors get cold feet and won't give them any more money. 5 years later, an American with major financial backers buys out their patents, takes his own version of the invention to market, and also receives all the credit for this world-changing innovation. No one even remembers the other guys' names. That's the story of the light bulb, which, as every Canadian schoolchild knows, was invented by Thomas Edison. Only it wasn't. Anthony, it's awesome to have you with us today. We're going to get into a bunch of questions, but why don't you maybe take a minute just to introduce yourself and say hi to the audience.
Thank you, guys, and thank you everyone for joining. Appreciate everything you guys are doing to put forward hopefully a brighter future for Canada and what we need to do to realize on what that future can be for all of us. So I've been a career founder and CEO my entire career, going back to the late 90s in the dawn of the internet age, and spent over 20 years as a founder and CEO in the Canadian Telecom Industry up until 2016, when we sold Wind Mobile to Shaw. And as I talk about in my book, speaking of my book, it was not a sale I wanted to have. I wanted to stay in the industry. I had made some great progress in terms of bringing real competition to the Canadian wireless industry, and we got into a position where it was really more of a forced sale for regulatory purposes. And now we have an opportunity to go back at it. So I'm made a proposal to reacquire the former Wind Mobile, now called Freedom Mobile, and step back into the entrepreneurial seat in Canada. But the backdrop for me is that I love this country, and I wrote the book because I love the country. The book's called How We Can Win, and it's all about what Canada, from my perspective, what Canada needs to do to become a world leading economy for the very long term. And the good news is we have all the tools already at our disposal, and it's just really a question of changing our mindset and putting those tools to work for us so that we can become the center seat on the world stage instead of being happy with third, fourth, and fifth place all the time.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to jump into the first question, but I just wanted to say on the title, I think this is a great theme and one we don't get, I think, often enough in Canada. It seems to me that the theme is often, how can we not lose? Or how can we be like top 10? Or maybe even how can we more fairly distribute the gains of our last victories, but not how can we win more, which is a much more kind of future-oriented, ambitious way of thinking about things. And there's been a lot of discussion of whether this is a sociological thing. It's, you know, Canadians are too humble or something. I don't know, but I think we need to win more. And I think the book is great, and I recommend that everybody in the audience pick it up. So I think what we're going to try to do is start broadly with our questions, and then we'll try to narrow in a little bit more. So let me start with a very broad question, and you know, take it wherever you want to. So we'll start with competition, which is of course a topic that you're very familiar with, one that you've written a lot about. It does feel to me like Canada's economy is dominated by oligopolies. So telecom and banking are the obvious ones, but it does seem like we have in many industries a few big players that are semi-protected, but semi-not, but either way kind of act to crowd out new entrants and competition. So first question, why do you think that is? Why do you think we've achieved this equilibrium where we have so many oligopolies? And what do you think we need to do broadly, whether culturally, politically, policy-wise, to make our country more competitive and to allow for more new entrants and competition?
Well, Chris, I don't think that there's one silver bullet or magic solution to this. This is really a whole bunch of incremental things that have to happen, but all of it can be brought under a few big umbrellas. The first being our mindset as a country. We our roots as a British colony. We spent the first 150 plus years of our history exporting natural resources and so on to the British Empire. We spent the last 75 or more 100 years exporting to the current world power, our neighbor to the south, the United States, and that's put us in a position where we're always sort of the junior partner in the supply chain, and it's for no other reason other than that has where our roots started, because that's entrenched a mindset of what we often call today as a branch plant mindset, a branch plant economy. And it still is pervasive in our country. In the automotive industry today, of course, we assemble vehicles for every major multinational car manufacturer, but we have yet to successfully build and export at scale a Canadian car for no reason other than our mindset, in my opinion. And so there's one big umbrella of mindset. The second big umbrella is a culture of risk aversion. And we talk about this, ad nauseum in Canada. How do we change this? Well, and I make a lot of recommendations about that. Right from my perspective, at a very young age, we need to start teaching our Canadian kids about the entrepreneurial path that you can take, and not talking about the risks associated with that and the certain failures that are associated with that being negative, but rather talk about the certain failures as what they really are, learning experiences. And not just paying lip service to that, though, too, because we often talk about, oh, well, we need to change this culture of risk aversion, and we don't take the steps to do it. And I think it starts from a very young age that we need to start thinking about this in our education system. And the third big area that I would talk about is investment in innovation from our big companies. We need to increase R&D spending broadly amongst our Fortune 50, Fortune 100, or however you want to define that, Fortune 500 Canadian companies even, and where they are underinvesting. And part of it has to do with the nature of the oligopolies that you reference. And as I would say, is I think that the history of every industry in Canada is slightly different. But you're right, we have ended up in a place where we are dominated by oligopolies. And that, of course, leads to complacency, leads to less investment in R&D, leads to higher profit margins, which are addictive, of course. But I think that it has a long-term, very negative impact on the country. So those three big areas, I would say, is what you get. But then you need to, obviously take it down many levels and talk about what can we do in each industry to solve this. But if you can fix those big issues, then I think we can go a long way towards realizing a dream of a much more prosperous Canada.
Yeah, I think one of the things that jumped out to me in your book is this sort of this lack of emphasis in Canada on productivity. I mean, I think the competition as a driver towards productivity. You'll hear a lot from our politicians. We tend to celebrate things like employment. More jobs created. This to me feels a little bit like a symptom of that same underlying sort of problem of like this branch economy where 1,000 new jobs get created at an assembly plant for some American auto parts manufacturing company or something like that. And we celebrate employment, and we don't necessarily look at productivity as a metric as much as maybe we should. For one, it feels like consumers don't necessarily understand that competition drives better outcomes for them. And what's the story that we need to tell so that our politicians understand this? Maybe they do and they intentionally ignore it. But every time I see a sticker like a headline of like 100,000 new jobs created in a month, it feels like we're kind of glazing over the underlying question or the underlying problem. Have we seen productivity move forward in this country? And how are all these sort of themes related in your mind?
I mean, I think that there's kind of those immediate wins, Matt, that when you talk about, the most recent examples, of course, in the tech industry, like a new Amazon headquarters. And of course, we all got very excited about that. But of course, that's just perpetuating our branch plant economy now in tech versus a Shopify, which has created a platform and has exported it globally successfully and is a category killer by all metrics. So for me, this is a big part of what is necessary is celebrating our successes. So I think it is incumbent on all of our elected officials to celebrate Shopify a lot more than celebrating a new Amazon headquarters. But that kind of near or immediate win of this many more thousands of jobs is, of course, an important pillar as well. And so we can't lose sight of that. But this is just, where do we put emphasis? And so for me, putting emphasis on those Canadian startups, including yours, Matt, for that matter. I mean, these are great places for people to go work. And why wouldn't we talk to people in our kids in high school and college about, hey, there's so many amazing Canadian startups that you can go work at. Why not make that an amazing path for someone versus saying, guess what, at the campus recruitment event, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google, I can go down the list, dominate those events. I think we got to make it a lot more exciting for young Canadians to stay in Canada. I talk a lot about that, but also join an entrepreneurial startup in Canada, and especially at a young age when you can afford to take those risks. Even if we can't overcome this risk aversion broadly in our culture in the near term, what we certainly can do is encourage young Canadians to at least follow a more entrepreneurial path and join a promising Canadian startup as an example. But this applies across all aspects of our economy, actually. If we look at the public sector, not-for-profits, academia, we have this long history of incredible innovation in Canada that we then don't follow through on and really scale across multiple industries. You raised the light bulb example from my book. That's, to me, an incredible example where now 150 years has gone by since Matthew Woodward created those patents around the incandescent light bulb in Canada, and Thomas Edison and his descendants and all the industry around it has received a staggering economic benefit for the United States, not for Canada. And so this is kind of, when we look forward, if we keep perpetuating the branch plant economy in automotive, in tech, that's what we can look forward to 100 years from now. Is this another dozen, 100,000 examples like we have with the light bulb? So this is kind of going back to my first answer. There's not like one silver bullet here. It requires a wholesale mindset change to really push forward. And I think getting into our education system would be a really, really good place to start. So the next generation of Canadians see trailblazing and creating new services, new products for export globally as a real viable, exciting path that is fraught with risks and failures, no doubt, but you're not going to be, crucified by our society if and when you do have those failures. We're going to prop you back up and stand you back up and let you go at it a second, third, fourth, fifth time until you hit it huge and you do build a category killer.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It's there are a lot of people in the audience today, I think, who are kind of policy people. We're drawing from a lot of people who have either worked in government or currently work in government. And when we ask questions like this, I think like what they and frankly myself, I think often in terms of policy, what we want to hear is like, get rid of the CRTC rule that doesn't allow for foreign-owned telecom or something like that, or get the federal government to issue more bank charters so we have a more competitive, kind of like things that we could write up in a one-pager and then lobby the right minister to get it done. But what you're talking about is a broader cultural shift, which I think in many ways is much more challenging, right? Because we can't just like sit around the table, write this white paper, build support for it, run a PR campaign and get it passed. But you're really talking about having people think differently about what they can do with their lives, and kind of like pushing the level of ambition up, which coincidentally is what we're trying to do in a very small way with this series. We want to kind of reinforce the idea that you don't need to be a spectator to the future, but you can actually be a participant. And you kind of shape it, according to your own designs. So I'm actually, I don't have a question. That was a comment. I'm going to pass. Matt has a question, I think, about this own the podium idea that you floated in your book, which I think is one way to kind of get this cultural shift, or at least to try to influence it. So maybe tell us a bit about that.
What I would say, Chris, just on that, let me react to that, because as I said earlier, like we have all these tools at our disposal. We have a great education system by global standards. We have great healthcare by global standards. We have strong democratic institutions. We have a very progressive and inclusive culture. We're leading the world. We led the world in things like gay marriage. We're consistently leading the world in so many amazing ways socially. Why can't we lead the world in business? And there is no reason other than our mindset. This is what the conclusion I've come to. And so, yes, policymakers need to do things in the near term to take us long-term directionally towards and make those immediate moves. But what I think we need to do is define that long-term first. What is that North Star we're headed towards? And to me, it's a category killer across a number of technology industries, automotive industries, healthcare. We have incredible research going on in healthcare, incredible research. We just don't commercialize it at a global scale and take over a category at a global scale. We give that to US pharma to do, right? And so I think this is the shift we have to, but it's a decision. It's not like it's not available to us. It's immediately available to us if we just make that decision as a society in Canada.
Yeah, well, actually, before Matt gets to own the podium, it does also seem like success begets more success, right? Because one of the ways that people change their minds is by seeing positive examples of, we see Anthony Lacavera, you did this, right? Which means it might be difficult, but now we at least know it's possible. So it's something to strive toward. And I guess like kickstarting that positive cycle of, role models, kind of inspiring the next generation and so on and so forth is something that we're trying to accelerate.
I think less of a question and maybe more of just a call out to the analogy that you use around sort of like Olympic athletes, right? And the Own the Podium program that the country's been supporting for, I think, at least the last decade, if not more, where we've decided at one point, and maybe, some would argue maybe not enough, but we decided at one point that it was important for Canada to have a strong showing on the international stage when it came to our athletes, when it came to sports that we wanted to be well known for, either historically relevant Canadian sports like hockey or new sports. I mean, Canada all of a sudden has a huge interest in becoming a viable country at the World Cup, right? This was
Yep.
This was a cultural decision that was made,
Yes.
driven primarily by people that found this to be like a worthwhile pursuit.
And
And
tennis.
now it's become
And
like
tennis,
a national
right?
imperative. We have to be a country that makes it to the World Cup, right? I think, I mean, you talk about not going for bronze in the book. I thought that
Yeah.
was a really good analogy, but that seems to be a mindset that's tough to break.
It really is, right? It really is. I mean, in the 2012 Olympics, there were some commentators on CTV that spent a half hour talking about the fact that Canada had its best ever showing of the number of bronze medals. And so we were celebrating beyond belief, being number one at being number three. and this is just we just gotta make a decision to think, and we do think differently in some ways. It amazes me how we, whether we go out and play hockey expecting to win gold. There's an expectation. Doesn't matter the US is 10 times bigger. It doesn't matter that there's great hockey programs in Scandinavian countries, Russia, and so on. We expect to win. Our default is we can definitely win and we should win. We just need to actually start thinking that way in our business culture and start out from, we're not going to create a company. And this is why I tip my hat all the time to the Shopify example. We're not going to start a company to export from Ontario to BC. We're going to start a company to export from Ontario to 185 countries. And we're going to create thousands of jobs in Ontario by exporting globally. And this is just simply a decision that our entrepreneurs have to make, and our governments I think are doing a great job of starting to really support this. By the way, we certainly have a great incubator and accelerator ecosystem now over the last 10 years that has been put into effect, and now we've got to now take the next step and really be able to scale these businesses globally with domestic capital sources, so that the capital tables are still here in Canada, and the benefits.
And I think going back to the earlier thought on sort of labor productivity. I mean, I think it's another way to think about just the leverage and impact that a Canadian company can have when the addressable market is the world and not the domestic Canadian market, right? What can you do when you're 10,000 employees, let's say Shopify, and you've got your eyes on the global market versus when you're 10,000 employees and you've got your eyes on the domestic market? I mean, the impacts are significantly different, right? In terms of, let's say, GDP created per employee hired or something like that, right? Some metric along those lines. But it requires that we encourage an appetite for global domination, right? In key industries and in key verticals.
It's a great example in my industry, the telecom industry, where there is really, the wireless industry started globally around the same time in Canada as all other countries. If you take a look at Vodafone or Orange, two European-based mobile carriers, and Vodafone at the peak, I think, was in 84 countries. Why is BCE or Telus or Rogers in one country? Why? They're
not competitive. I mean, that's the short answer, right? They wouldn't be competitive in any other market.
Actually, I think it's something different. I think that they are extremely well-run companies, Matt, and I think that they would absolutely kick ass globally, but they don't have the mindset of exporting what's great about Canada. They don't have that mindset, and the shareholder base is looking for dividends and consistent dividends. The executives are confronted with risk versus reward choices all the time that push further towards the risk end of that. To the risk aversion end of that spectrum. And so you end up where we are today, where Vodafone ends up, in 30 years being in 84 countries, and Bell, Telus, and Rogers. Now, there were some incredible innovation, thinking back to Ted Rogers, he did expand Rogers into the US, and Telus has been successful with Telus International. So there are some elements of it, but I think that there was an amazing moment in 2008 when Sprint Nextel, for example, could have been acquired. They had, at the time, 35 million subscribers, about, bigger than the Canadian market. Could have been acquired by Bell, Telus, or Rogers with the resources on hand at the time. And so why didn't that happen? And we could have created another 10, 20, 30,000 jobs instead of Sprint being headquartered in Kansas. It could have been headquartered in Vancouver or Calgary or Toronto. There was an incredible opportunity, but that didn't even occur because we have this cultural inertia. But the world needs more Canada. We bring so many great operating capabilities and intellectual capital to the table. There's a reason why there's all these big tech companies recruiting in Canada and building branch plants in Canada. I mean, it's because our education system is amazing, and Canadians are smart, generally smart, decent people that are highly productive. Actually, we got 400,000 Canadians living in the Silicon Valley now, 200,000 living in New York. You know, let's call it, 1.5% of our population living in New York and the Silicon Valley. I don't know, what do they produce? They would produce 7 or 8 or 9% of Canadian GDP. I mean, those are extremely high output Canadians, but they're high output paying taxes in the United States. This is the issue. But we raised them, we educated them. They grew up here with Canadian values, and we exported that person instead of having a group of those people make a company and export that globally.
Yeah, I think what's very interesting in that answer is because you have the experience and domain expertise that you do, you see the counterfactual. You see like what could be if we just tweaked, let's say, our mindsets, our culture, our policy a little bit, which is probably what makes you both really passionate about this topic, and I'm sure frustrated that we're not doing these things, because if we don't imagine that things could be better, then the status quo is fine, right? So diving into telecom a little bit more, so I operate a digital product studio here in Toronto. All the products we build are on Amazon Web Services, right? That layer has been handled for us. Amazon Web Services is on top of ISPs. Yep. That's been handled for us. And then kind of the base layer, really the base layer is telecom, right? It's connectivity. So it's hard to kind of, I think, overstate the importance of that sector. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience with wind, like the specific points of friction and frustration that you found, like that kind of limits our ability to be both more competitive and more ambitious. And then just kind of tying this into a question that somebody asked in the audience, why is competition the right answer? Why is it not something like a public option or straight up nationalizing?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So look, I think in the telecom industry, there's a lot of debate about what a more competitive market could look like, or should look like, or would look like. I am a proponent of the fourth carrier policies, and I capitalized on the fourth carrier policy, brought capital from abroad into the country, acquired spectrum, built a independent network that's independent of Bell, Telus, Rogers, and operated as Wind. And prices did come down. Canadians do want that choice, and that choice, as important as making a choice for a lower cost offering, which in today's environment of high inflation and wobbling housing prices is probably even more important than it was when we got Wind off the ground. But it's critically important for Canadians and Canadian families. But as important as that is the customer journey and customer experience. And when you talk about that underlying layer, now in a 5G world, what's very exciting in a 5G world is Internet of Things has truly arrived. AR, VR, the metaverse can truly be done. Real-time applications like autonomous vehicles, autonomous transportation, all of those things can be made real and practical by 5G networks. Connected healthcare, when we start talking about remote surgeries and making healthcare accessible and affordable across this country, and accessible, having experts accessible remotely using wireless networks. I mean, it's very exciting. Education becoming more democratized and a higher quality across the country because it's accessible and affordable. And I mean affordable from a public sector standpoint, right? A lot of these issues are constrained by historically by technology. So whether it's publicly funded or privately funded, the same constraints apply in a lot of ways here. So I think that there's no doubt that Canadians embraced Wind as an alternative, and we had a great and very successful run. And what it forced is more investment in innovation, more R&D investment amongst Bell, Telus, and Rogers. And so the whole market was elevated by the presence of an independent national carrier. And this is really the key point. It's really the ripple effect of having that national independent competitor out there. Because of course, as I said already, those three big companies in wireless that dominate the market are extremely well-run companies, actually, and have a long history of being well-run companies. And so from an operating standpoint, they're able to invest more, they're able to innovate, they're able to bring new products and services to market. But if I don't have competitive pressure, why would I ever do that? If something's not forcing me to get off get off the couch and stop watching Stranger Things, why don't I just stay watching Stranger Things and, finish season 4 or whatever in a binge watch, right? You have to have something pushing. And I'll, I always use the big ship analogy. Like these companies are big ships. Once they turn, you better not be in the way when they come at you, because you are going to get run over by them. But it takes them a long time to turn. So we can't just have short-term competitive pressure and say, oh, well, okay, we had this little flash of competitive pressure, and because that's not going to push the big ship to turn, right? And with wind, we had just got to the point where we were really having great success. And then unfortunately, our investor group, my investor group, couldn't get regulatory approvals to continue in Canada. And so we were forced to sell to Shaw. And as you would expect, Shaw is part of the oligopoly as a legacy cable company. And so, the competitive tension in Ontario, BC, and Alberta that was benefiting consumers with wind in the market went away. And so it's greatly unfinished business for me. Why am I passionate about stepping back into it? I was mid-flight at restructuring the Canadian telecom industry to make it permanently competitive. And if I've given the opportunity again now, I fully intend to ensure it becomes competitive. I was long-term to begin with. I never wanted to sell. I publicly voted against selling the company because the company was doing great. But we had those regulatory challenges. So I think that this is the most important thing to remember about competition. You can't expect to see results in 1 or 2 years. These are big industries and well-run companies. It's not like the Canadian banks are poorly run. I personally think they're very well run, and I think they maximize profits as any good leadership team would do, good operating team would do. And unless they feel competitive pressure and are pushed to innovate, why move dollars out of the P&L, out of the bottom line into the new product and service when you can just keep rolling the way things are? And you have, in the case of the big banks or big telecoms or big energy companies in Canada, you have, 100,000, 200 million shareholders all saying, amazing, thank you for that dividend, you're doing a great job. So there needs to be that push. And that's what competition brings. Competition, more than anything else, we focus on price and immediate benefits of price all the time. But the real benefits for Canada are over a 10, 20, 30, 50-year stretch. And this is what we have to keep our eye on. Again, going back to that North Star. So when I talk to groups about this theme of competition and about my book and about the mindset, yes, it's a huge lift to start changing people's mindset. Yes, it's a huge lift. And yes, it will take a long time. But again, once we turn these big ships in a direction, let me just say, I think that the Canadian leadership teams running banks, running telecoms, running energy companies, running transportation companies, I think that they could really show up strong on the world stage. And I think we see evidence of that, and some flashes of evidence of that, right? TD in the US, TD Bank, you can't look on a corner in Manhattan now in New York without seeing a TD Bank. I think that's amazing, and I just think we gotta do more of it, because we do know what we're doing. We just got to choose to go out there and be a category killer.
Yeah, I think it's a great point that competition doesn't just introduce another option; it kind of forces all incumbents to level up. Yes. It reminds me, I've been watching a show on Apple TV called For All Mankind. I don't know if you've seen this by any chance, but it basically portrays an alternative history where in 1969 the Soviets win the space race to the moon, which means that the competition doesn't stop. It keeps going. And because it keeps going, we all make it to Mars by 1995. And I think there's something like really profound there, that there's this term, mimetic rivalry, right? That you kind of need to see someone else like nipping at your heels to push you to innovate harder, and be more ambitious and that sort of thing. So I do think that's an underrated perspective. It's not just about now we have a fourth option. It's also every option just got better. And yes, some, to your point, some of it takes time, but it's just like the dynamic has shifted.
And that did happen, by the way. It was like, this is not, this is sort of not, perspective or speculative. In fact, when wind was in the marketplace, the customer satisfaction scores at Bell, Telus, and Rogers went up because they improved their overall customer experience. They improved their pricing, they improved their products and services, because they can easily do it. They're capable of doing it writ large, when they're pressured to do it. But no rational person on their own would do it. And I would say that really couples perfectly with an earlier point that we were talking about, which is celebrating our successes. So and you talk about like in the space race, every single Canadian kid knows Elon Musk, right? Everyone knows Elon Musk. Everyone knows Bill Gates. Everyone knows Mark Zuckerberg. But how many people really know Toby Lutke?
Yeah.
And that's one of the biggest market cap tech companies, platform category killer in the world. But we don't celebrate our successes to the same degree as U.S. companies do, and as the U.S. culture does. And I'm not suggesting we should lionize these people. Obviously, there are limits, and you could argue it goes beyond in some U.S. settings, but there has to be some element of that. And so it was a good moment to circle back on that point, which is why I want to bring it back up.
Yeah, and you mentioned Elon Musk. I was going to say, I mean, like back to this point of competition, obviously there's a tendency to want that competition to occur within Canada because, we'd be the beneficiaries of a new company like Wind, for example. But I'd be curious as to your thoughts on Starlink and what foreign competition coming into our Wi-Fi market, sort of what kind of pressure does that put onto the big three? Are we going to see a significant shift in the way we think about internet connectivity? I mean, my in-laws live in rural British Columbia. We have a Starlink connection. I love it.
Yeah.
I can't wait till it comes to rural Ontario.
Yeah.
And lots of forms of competition that I think are not always domestically born competitors, right? I
think that's a great point, Matt, and I think it will be disruptive. And I think that there are limits. Without getting into too much of a technical discussion, there are limits to what satellites can do versus terrestrial cellular. And just in terms of the distances the signals have to travel, there's the speed of light, actual physical limitations on speed, latency specifically on the connections. But suffice to say, it's going to be disruptive, and I think it's a great competitive force. And it's not like and I had some personal exposure to this in the early days of Starlink. It's not like they were thinking, let's talk about the northern U.S. or rural U.S. Like the business plan from the get-go was we will connect the 2 billion people in the world that don't have a connection.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just Elon's. That's just from where he started. Right. And so, but it's not. Why can't we have Canadian entrepreneurs start there? I'm going to connect. In your business, Matt, for example, in the fintech universe, there's a billion unbanked people. Why don't we just have that be where we start? I'm gonna bring banking to the 1.5 billion people that are unbanked. As an example, I just think we got to change our mindset because we have all the capabilities to go after it.
Yeah, I mean, it may be a little bit less of an aspirational example, but somebody in the audience referenced the book "Why Don't Mexicans Drink Molson?" Right. Sort of playing off the fact that we all love drinking Corona, but when Molson got started, they didn't have their eyes on how do I get a Molson in the hands of every global beer drinker out there, right? So, yeah, it definitely is. There's a pervasive cultural issue there.
Definitely, and it's, by the way, still really great beer. I'm not a big beer drinker, but Molson is my go-to from when I was high.
All right, well, let me shift this a little bit to the world of politics. I'm curious. You've been adjacent to politics for a long time. I mean, obviously, the role you played with Wind, you obviously had to interact with the regulator and policymakers. I think you referenced Tony Clement having been an instrumental part of even getting approval for Wind to go live in the first place. Have you found yourself, politically active in any way outside of sort of your work? I always think about the void that I find being an entrepreneur active in the world of politics. And is there a mindset that our political class could benefit from having more people that think about building and creating and innovating within politics? Like, how do you think about time spent as an entrepreneur? Is it worthwhile use of your time to get active in politics?
So I have not historically been active in politics, Matt. It's not currently on my, agenda, medium or long term. I think that I have an ability to have a very positive impact on Canadians if I can make the wireless industry more competitive, which I know how to do. I have started to do it before, and I will finish that work if given the opportunity. I think it's the same mindset. I mean, and I talk about this in the book as well. The mindset question applies across all walks of life in Canada. How do we create a mindset that is, we're going to go after being the category killer. We're going to go after being number one. We're going to go for the gold. Because from everything that I can see, and we spent a lot of time in the research for that book on macroeconomics, where does Canada really stand up from a macroeconomic standpoint, an education standpoint, healthcare, the democratic institutions, and so on. And the good news is, as I said right at the top of the conversation, we have all the tools at our disposal already to build globally dominant companies that will create incredible long-term prosperity benefits for Canadians. And we have a great emerging class of entrepreneurs in Canada that want to scale and build their businesses here in Canada. And I think that particularly in the last 10 years, I think government has done a very good job of creating policies to fund incubators and accelerators, to double down on winners, as I talk a lot about in the book, and celebrate winners, celebrate our successes, think about restructuring things like the SRED, the SHRED tax credit, so that instead of spreading it around Canadian style and giving everybody a little bit, but nobody can win, like narrowing the focus of those types of policies so that we can really feed the winners and build global category winners. So I think there's a lot of good things going on, actually. And I'm really encouraged, actually, to see the focus on all of this from governments at all levels. I do think there's, still, of course, work to be done. There always will be. But I think where I would like to see us focus now is think about in our education system, how can we at a young age start to tell these stories about great Canadian entrepreneurs, start to tell stories about great Canadian builders, and not just entrepreneurs, by the way, in starting new business, but also entrepreneurs in every walk of life. So people that are innovating, really what we want to talk about is innovators, people that are innovating in academia, people that are innovating in not-for-profits and charities, people that are innovating in government, and showcasing those examples and those successes and talking about them in a positive way, informing people about them, because it's certainly not happening today. We can talk about the automotive industry as an example. I don't think any young Canadian could name Frank Stronach, for example, the founder of Magna, but there is a globally dominant, automotive company that originated from somebody who came from Austria with literally nothing, and built an incredible company over a very long period of time, and built a great leadership team, including Don Walker, of course, who was the CEO for a long time, who I count as a friend, who led that company through an incredible expansion phase. But so there's an example of a great Canadian entrepreneur, Frank Stronach, and a great Canadian CEO, Don Walker. I don't think we talk about them at all in our education system. So I think figuring out how to weave in our curriculum these stories of great Canadian innovators, talking about our great political leaders over the last 30, 40 years that have had a great positive impact on the country. We don't talk about them, nearly enough. People that have done incredible philanthropic work. Canadians are very philanthropic, as we all know in this conversation, but we don't celebrate them. So Peter Gilligan right now, we'll talk about the Toronto example, like incredible, philanthropic support of our healthcare system from Peter Gilligan. And, again, it's not something that we really talk about. So I think this is kind of where I would like to see more of a focus. And in terms of my own energy, I wrote the book for that reason. It's a book about Canada, how we can win as a country. And if I'm going to take another step to answer your question more directly, Matt, in terms of politics, it would be a follow-up to that book. Like, okay, what have we done? What can we now do next to keep going in the right direction?
Well, for one, I think that would be really welcome from people sort of paying attention to this topic. But I think you made an earlier comment that sort of rings true for me, is that we seem to be lacking a little bit of a clear picture as what is the aspiration for the country over the course of the next 50 or 100 years? Like, what do we want the country to look like? And I think there's a national ambition that trickles down into the way people think about their own lives and their own careers. And if, Canada or a Canadian political leader would have a really hard time saying words like, we want to be the fastest growing economy in the world, or saying words like, we want to be better than the US, on any metric that you can choose. We're always sort of like being cautious and timid with our words. And I think that sort of translates into cultural issues, right? Being part of the G7, and we hang our hat on that, even though we might be the 12th or 13th largest economy, not the 7th largest economy, and we lose sight of the fact that we are slipping from the historic position that we've had as sort of a strong medium-sized economy. So something of a national ambition. Yeah,
I agree. And the world is moving. The world's not waiting for Canada to pull up our socks and start running. I mean, we need our mindset to shift because certainly emerging Asian economies, I mean, I'll see the pace of innovation in China and India, for example. I mean, when we tried, it's sort of like out of sight, out of mind, I think, for a lot of Canadians. But I think that this, myself, having invested in startups around the world, and this show that I host on Bloomberg TV now called Beyond Innovation, where I'm profiling emerging founders, around the world. I got to tell you, like, we have a window to take advantage of all the tools we have and really go much bigger in our thinking and take a much more bold stance, or lose, right? That's really where we're at, because I think I'd like to see our way of life perpetuated. I think that this place is decent. We have a mindset of not leaving people behind as best we can. It's far from perfect, obviously, our federation, but generally speaking, I think everyone in this conversation knows far more Canadians that are great people than not, and we just need to export more of Canada to the world so that we can bring the benefits of all of our capabilities to bear on all of the great social infrastructure and institutions that we already have in the country, but perpetuate them, right? Strengthen them, and in 50 years, instead of the trend lines looking so bad the way they do today, again, step by step, we can turn those ships to be pointing in the right direction, and then we're going to wake up in 25 years and be a world leader. Yeah. I have no doubt, actually. I have no doubt we can do it.
I'm gonna try to tie some of the questions of the audience. There's a few themes that I think are re-emerging. I think we'll probably end on this question too, but I think it's an important one. So part of the inspiration for the name of this series, Canadian Optimist, came from Peter Thiel's book 0 to 1, where he lays out this framework of optimist versus pessimist, and then definite versus indefinite in your kind of outlook of the future. And again, we landed on definite optimist as an interesting place to be. In that book, he also talks about, as a founder, you should really want to build a monopoly, right? Because these are the best businesses. This means you have like a true moat. It's defensible, which means your margins are strong. They won't be eroded away, great stuff. The challenge comes when policymakers start to agree with you and start to kind of like enable any sort of monopolistic strengths that you might have. So there are some questions from the audience around this idea of regulatory capture, and to what extent have some of these oligopolies really entrenched their position, not just through superior, organizational behavior or management or whatever, but really by just making it much tougher for new entrants to enter the market. And then to your point about a lot of Canadians leaving for Silicon Valley, I wonder how many of them are being pulled to Silicon Valley versus pushed out of Canada by some of this regulatory capture that makes it hard to navigate. So if you could, just to kind of wrap this up, like, to what extent do you think that's true? How important is it relative to these broader cultural and mindset factors? And then maybe how should we think about kind of dismantling it to the extent that it is true?
Look, I think that the regulatory framework for any industry is obviously critically important. I mean, I don't think anyone could suggest otherwise. I would say that in all of my interactions with government, historically and today, now on the most recent activity surrounding the Freedom Mobile opportunity, I look, they're very thoughtful, considerate people generally, and they want to see Canada succeed, right? And I think that, and they're also generally very smart people, as far as I actually commend our government for in the most recent activity, like for taking the steps they are taking to not just accept that a merger of Rogers and Shaw should happen, because there's going to be some efficiencies domestically, which really means job losses. Of course, we everybody understands that, and that the proposals they're making for competition in wireless will make sense. Of course, if I was Rogers, I would want the least competitive marketplace I can possibly achieve, right? That's the smart business thing to do. So in this example, in the immediate example, the regulatory oversight and intervention is critically important to ensuring we have a competitive marketplace long term. And I won't, I could talk for hours about that, but suffice to say that as far as I can see right now, our government is and is prepared to, and has already taken steps to intervene wherever and however necessary to ensure there is going to be a competitive marketplace in wireless. That's great news. But the long-term mindset has got to be, we want our industry to be globally competitive. And what that means is we need to look, in my opinion, look where else in the world is in this example, wireless, a very competitive industry. And the good news is we just can look south of the border where it's more competitive than Canada. And so what I'd like to see is our conversation in wireless, not just talk about what's the best we can achieve in Canada with what we have already in Canada, but what are the best practices globally? Since in that example, I mean, there are other industries where we already are in a leadership position and we just need to solidify it, in my view, and actually excel further. In this example, we are lagging is my belief. And so let's just look at a more competitive market, look where the best practices are, and let's import those to Canada. So in this example, it's T-Mobile and wireless delivered over mobile cellular, also fixed wireless access, replacing traditional cable and traditional fiber connections. And T-Mobile is now the fastest growing internet company in the United States using just wireless. So we need to ensure that we're bringing the best practices in that example to Canada, because in that example, we happen to not be a leader at this time. Not that we don't have the capabilities to, and not that I don't think Bell, Telus, and Rogers would quickly innovate and quickly improve their offering if they were pressured to do so. And so I think that's would be my message to policy makers on this point. But thinking more broadly is really about how do we have our mindset be that we're not going to just do okay and just do what's passable, but that we're going to excel and we're going to win. And setting our eyes on that North Star and then creating near-term policies that take us further in that direction, and I'm not an expert outside of the telecom industry, so I wouldn't even begin to try to advise on that. But I think that my point about the mindset is really, to me, what the most essential thing is. And the good news is that, again, as all the government interactions I've had, everyone that I've interacted with has the capabilities to do that. And so I think it's just really a question of making the decision to pursue that North Star. It's not going to, the difficulty is it's not going to, there's those immediate result things that we've got to achieve. And then there's also the long-term investments that we need to make. And I get, at least partially, I think I have no experience as a politician, obviously, but I get that there's a need for the short-term decisions. And the short-term wins are critical. I would just want to stress that let's not go after short-term wins that take us off the long-term North Star, right? Because we need to keep moving towards that. And so in that specific example that we talked about in this conversation, I don't like celebrating that Amazon's going to build a new headquarters in Canada. I think it's good. I think that we need to create the policy so they do it. I think that we need to give them the incentives so that they do it. I think we need to create those 50,000 jobs they were talking about in recent years. All of that is a big positive and a big win. But we don't need to celebrate it the way we did. We should celebrate more. How do we create 50,000 jobs in innovative Canadian emerging companies that are ultimately going to export their products and services and become global leaders? I mean, that's just the mindset shift, right? So what are we going to celebrate?
Well, Anthony, we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us and really giving us another angle on Canadian optimism. I think your challenge that we think bigger, we act bolder, is really central to Canadians being prepared for the challenges in front of us economically. And I also think that, there's a subtle, humble, but clear patriotism in a lot of what you say that I really appreciate. And I think that a lot of people listening are drawn to that as well, because we are proud of our country, but we also know that it's something we have to work at the same time. And I think that's exactly what your outlook offers. So we really appreciate it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who is grateful that you spent some time with us to give your take on Canadian optimism and share your insights as an entrepreneur in this country. I want to remind everyone again that we'll be back next month with another edition of the Canadian Optimist, and we hope that you will register to join us for our next networking conference in Red Deer, Alberta on September 24th, where we will be joined by some of the Alberta UCP leadership candidates. We'll be joined by the best-selling author in Canada right now, Andrew Lawton. We'll also be joined by many other guests who will be announced over the coming weeks, including the Hub's Sean Spear in conversation with Jason Kenney. Premier Kenney, it will be one of his last public engagements as Premier of Alberta. So you can register for that now. Visit our website, canadastrongandfree.network. We really appreciate you spending some time with us on a summer afternoon and look forward to chatting again soon.